Hi, I'm Pam Koloff. I'm a senior editor at Texas Monthly Magazine, and for our April 2008 issue, I compiled an oral history of the 51-day Branch Davidian standoff that happened in 1993 in Waco. Today I'll be talking to Byron Sage, former FBI agent who is the lead negotiator during the 51-day standoff. I thought a good place to start would be if we could talk about your background in negotiation before the standoff and what your experience had been as far as a negotiator up until 1993.
I've been involved in law enforcement for 37 years now, but at the time that this matter started, I'd been a negotiator in the FBI since 1976 and had worked bank robberies and kidnapping related type issues, but this was a totally unprecedented event.
How was this situation different than the typical negotiations that you had dealt with before in terms of the rules going in and what you were able to leverage from a negotiation standpoint?
Well, the most significant difference was that it wasn't a hostage situation. It was a barricaded, a very violent barricaded situation with over 100 individuals inside that wanted to be inside. And they were, it was a very challenging type of situation to be able to try to leverage parental instincts to get children out and so forth. It was a challenge from the moment we arrived, and unfortunately all the way up to the tragic end.
What are some of the things that you would do to leverage your position, say in a typical negotiation situation that you weren't able to do in this one?
Usually you try to get a good sense of who you're dealing with, what their motivation is. Is it a bank robber that didn't have any intention of being caught, and his or her sole objective is to leverage hostages to secure something that we can provide, and in their mind that's freedom.
Right.
Here we had individuals that were just voluntarily at the location, and beyond being voluntarily there, they had actually participated in the most violent gun battle in the history of law enforcement at that time.
Something that Gary Nesner talks about in the story is the fact that this began with a great deal of bloodshed, and that you all had to come into a situation where there was that precedent and then try to get the people inside this building to trust you. Right. And that in and of itself was extremely challenging. What were the strategies that you all used in the beginning to win the trust of some of the people inside, or to at least be able to start a dialogue?
To establish that rapport that you need, you really can't expect to affect change in an individual until you've earned it. And the way you try to earn it is to be as honest and as straightforward and as candid as you can, and also try to establish an element of trust in their mind that you're saying and doing whatever you're doing in their best interest. Well, that's very difficult when they've just come through nearly a 2+ hour gun battle that resulted in death on both sides.
Can you tell me how David Koresh was different than other people you've negotiated with in the past? What was he like to talk to during these negotiations?
Oh, David Koresh was an entirely different character than anyone I had dealt with before or since. He was a very charismatic leader of this group. I hesitate to call them a cult because that's such an offensive term, but they actually used it first during the course of discussion, so it became kind of a moot point. But David was an incredibly skillful manipulator, and he was a master of deception. The fact that there are so many questions that are still blurry out there in the public's eye is a demonstration that he continues to be successful in his mission even from the grave. an incredibly challenging individual because he was, I would liken him to a drop of oil on a rain bucket. If you can kind of put your finger on it, but as soon as you start to apply any pressure, then it's off in 20 different directions. That was David.
Okay.
And he had such a grasp of the New Testament in particular that you don't want to debate Christianity with somebody that theoretically could believe that he in fact is the second coming of Christ.
Right.
So he was a challenge from the beginning, and I don't know that he ever fit into a very specific category of individual that we had faced in the past.
From what I've read of the the conversations that took place, I think over 700 of them during these negotiations, he wanted to debate theology quite a bit. What were your feelings about whether that was appropriate to do? You touched on that a little bit before, but if he started to debate theology, would you all go there with him or try to turn the conversation in a different direction?
Normally, if you even suspect that an individual is delusional, you don't enter into their delusion because you'll never win, and win in quotes. Are you going to convince somebody that believes that they're Jesus Christ that their understanding of the scriptures is in error? No, you're not. But having said that, you need to honor and respect what is the most important in that person's sphere of operation, for lack of any other term. And his clearly was his message. His message was that he could open the mysteries of the 7 seals of the book of Revelation. Well, that opens up a lot of questions, but the first thing that you need to do is recognize the area that's important to him, respect it, and then try to delve and determine where he's coming from. Is this a heartfelt investment, or is it his chosen area of con?
Okay.
And in this instance, my belief is that it was his chosen area of con. He was very skillful at it.
Wondering about the videotapes that the negotiation team made of themselves and sent in to try to connect with the Davidians a little bit more, try to humanize the negotiation team. Tell me a little bit about that decision and what you all put on those videotapes.
The videotape that was sent in of the negotiators was a unique technique. I've been a negotiator for a number of years, since 1976. I've never done that before, and I've never done it since. The only reason we did it is because they solicited from us some input as to who we were and where we were coming from and what did we look like and so forth. Well, the early stages of a negotiation where you're trying to get a lid on the violence and to establish rapport, it's vitally important that you give them something to connect to. When we're negotiating, it's not unusual for law enforcement officers to have what we call information boards right across from the negotiators so that they can visualize the person they're talking to, even if it's a mug shot. And that's what we had of David.
Okay. Well, it's interesting too, talking about Steve Schneider, and we talked about this a little bit in our interviews, that he was so loyal to David Koresh and even made a videotape, I think, of his wife Judy's child with David Koresh, and was okay with that configuration of things.
When does a light bulb go off that, where is this in Scripture that my Savior is a bigamist and a pedophile and an abusive individual and a liar, and so, eventually. And Steve Schneider had a degree in theology.
Right.
Pardon this statement, but by God, you would think that he would have at some point in time stepped back and said, wait a minute, this just doesn't fit.
I wanted to ask you specifically about your face-to-face meeting with Steve Schneider, and I was sorry that we didn't have the space for this in the story because it's a very key part of what happened. But I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about that, how far into the process, into the 51 days this was, and why you all decided to do that.
I've been a negotiator for a long time, and we always teach other law enforcement agencies, other negotiators in the FBI, that if there has been a demonstration of violence, a propensity to injure or to inflict injury on someone, you never expose yourself to that. Never. Well, I've quite literally gone in and changed those slides to hardly ever, for a lack of any other term. The decision to go face-to-face, to have a face-to-face meeting right outside the front of the compound where 4 federal agents had been murdered and 16 had been wounded less than 2 weeks before, was not an easy decision, and it was not something we entered into lightly. But the reason we did it is we were no longer getting any children out. They were our first priority. We hadn't had a child out of that compound since the 5th of March. This was now, the face-to-face was on the 15th of March.
Okay.
And the decision was made to do it in order to be able to look right into the eyes of the individuals that we had been trying to make progress with, and to convey to them without any reservation or any deception that we were truly trying to get this resolved peacefully and get their grievances into a court of law.
What was that conversation like? How long did it last for, and what did you all come to decide at the end of that?
It's almost surreal looking back at it. It was very contentious initially. Wayne Martin was a Harvard Law School graduate and very confrontational, very accusatory that the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, ATF, had stepped beyond their bounds in the raid on the 28th of February, and that the FBI basically was just continuing the same course of action, that we had, in his words, that we had suspended the constitutional rights of those inside the compound, and that we were exercising some form of illegal martial law. There's 2 documents that I live by. The first and foremost is the Bible, and the second one is the Constitution of the United States. And the fact that all 4 of us were out there standing in front of God and everybody, as well as, I'm sure, snipers on both sides, and willing to lay that out as a mutual foundation of respect and faith, was huge. And I think it set a very solid foundation for the rest of the discussions. Did it help? We started getting additional people out that very same day, but we never did get another child out. What they didn't know was that we had successfully been able to insert a listening device in a concealment that just happened to end up in a room where David Koresh was residing inside the compound. So we were able then to get the rest of the story.
Okay.
When they went back inside, when I came back, and when Jack Harwell came back, we debriefed with our commanders, they debriefed with theirs. I laid out everything that we had discussed, the key points that I thought that we needed to get written guarantees that we could accomplish these things. At the same time, Steve Schneider and Wayne Martin are debriefing with David Koresh. And on the tapes, you can hear a very different side than what was portrayed out there in the middle of that field. Steve basically says, you know, I think their hearts are in the right place. He had some complimentary things to say about both Sheriff Jack Harwell and myself, the fact that we had stepped out there and met with them. But by the same token, Steve Schneider had suggested that we have another meeting. And I told him that I'd bring documentation, not just my assessment as to whether or not we could accomplish this, but guarantees that we weren't going to seize the property, that they could continue the ministry and so forth. I thought he was genuinely excited about that. But when he conveys it to David, he says, they want to meet again in a couple of days. Do you want me to keep this bullshit up? Pardon my expression, but that's a quote. And I was shocked because, you know, David was not the only skillful deceiver in there, because Steve had convinced me that he was trying to deal with me, and we had been talking since day one in good faith.
Right.
And here clearly, as he's talking to his boss, he just wants to know if David wants to continue to stretch the deception.
After, at the end of the siege, and this was after the fire and after everything has happened, you were able to listen to some more of these tapes that were made that you weren't able to listen to in real time. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about maybe another side again of Schneider that you heard on those tapes that you had not known about at the time.
Early on, I called in there at approximately 6 o'clock in the morning at the direction of my commander to warn them that we were prepared to introduce tear gas. Steve Schneider, who I ended up talking with that morning, confirms that you're going to put tear gas in here. I said, yes, but we're not coming in. He hung up the phone on me and immediately turns around on the mic. You hear the rest of it, where he informs everybody they're putting tear gas in here, put on your gas mask. It wasn't 5 minutes after that instruction that the first orders go out to pour the fuel. Now, these are Davidians inside the compound, inside the building, the crisis site, beginning to pour flammable liquid throughout their own residence a little after 6 o'clock in the morning. And as you review these tapes, you continue to hear that same direction. They poured fuel through most of the morning. This place had to have been saturated with gasoline, diesel fuel, Coleman kerosene, what have you, by the Davidians, not by us. The other thing that you hear right at the very end, just before the microphone ceases to function, and we think it was probably put out of commission by one of the tracked vehicles, you hear a voice that I had talked to for 51 days. There is no doubt in my mind that it was Steve Schneider. He clearly gives the order to start the fires.
Now, I know, and I'll make this my last question, but I know that you weren't able to hear these tapes in real time, that you heard these much later, but and also that hindsight is 20/20, and this was a very difficult situation, I think, for everyone involved on both sides. What, in hindsight, do you wish, if anything, had been done differently from a negotiation standpoint or from the FBI standpoint in general?
You know,
and specifically about that last day.
That's probably the question that will haunt a lot of us for the rest of our lives. I don't know what else could have been done differently. We put in 110% effort every single day. That's the only way I can live with this. The true tragedy here is the loss of life of those kids. The kids that couldn't make their own decision. The parents, I lament the loss of their lives, but it was their decision, and it was their action, frankly. The only reason that I've continued to agree to interviews and so forth is because I refuse to allow history to be misrepresented or inaccurately recorded. Too many people to this day, still don't understand the efforts and extraordinary efforts that law enforcement agents, support people everybody put into trying to resolve this. We owe it to 4 ATF agents that were murdered on the 28th of February, and frankly, we owe it to the Branch Davidians that perished as well. Over the course of the 51 days, we got a total of 46 people out. 21 of those were children, and that's lost. It's a footnote in history. If we could have gotten one more person out, we would have tried everything to do it.